I'm playing this NES game that I borrowed from Albert.
Your friend Albert?
My dad comes in and he sees me playing this game that he didn't buy for me, that he knew I didn't own. And so he starts sort of interrogating me. And he's like, "Where'd you get this?" And I tell him, "Oh yeah, I'm borrowing this game from Albert." "Oh yeah, and by the way, Albert wants to borrow one of my games." That's where you could start cutting the air with a knife.
What do you think this is?
But first, a word about this video's sponsor, Factor. Growing up in the 90s, Christmas time was always a season for giving, goodwill toward men, and good cooking in the kitchen.
How is it, Tyler? Good?
Ah, yes. Nothing quite like those holiday meals cooked fresh by the best chefs in the family. Thanks to Factor, we can still have ourselves a merry little Christmas dinner, even if the family isn't around. Factor's delicious, ready-to-eat meals fit perfectly into my already extremely busy holiday schedule. It's amazing to me that meals of this quality came straight from their oven to my door. Every fresh, never-frozen meal is chef-crafted, dietitian-approved, and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Choose from a weekly menu of 35 options, including popular options like Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, or vegan and veggie. Factor meals eliminate the hassle of prepping, cooking, or cleaning up. Simply heat and savor the good stuff. Guys, the older I get, healthy options that also taste good are important to me. Gotta stay healthy for my growing family. And Factor is flexible. Change your order up every week with plans from 4 to 18 meals per week, or pause or reschedule your deliveries anytime. Head to Factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50RetroLife to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50RetroLife at Factor75.com and get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. Thank you, Factor, for sponsoring today's video.
Dad taught me to take care of my video games, handle them with care. This means that up until the age of maybe 14 or 15, my dad would not let me even handle any disc-based video game. Starting with the Sega CD, our very first one, every disc-based game had to be handled by Dad. He was the one to put them in the consoles for me to play. Whenever I wanted to play a Sony PlayStation game or a Sega CD game, TurboGrafx CD, I would have to ask Dad to put it on for me.
And open up the eject. And there's the CD spinning. Take it out. That's it. Let's see that CD. Pretty wild.
It's not that he didn't trust me with these video games. I mean, he actually was the one who taught me how to care for these games and taught me that they were expensive and they needed to be well cared for, that I shouldn't just fling them around like some action figure or toy. It was that Dad knew these were expensive and really we couldn't replace them if we broke them, or if I somehow snapped the disc while I was trying to get it out of its case, or if I scratched it up too much, that would be it.
That's cool, right?
Yeah, this is just the machine opening.
There were times I remember I wanted to play a game that we owned, and I couldn't even play it until my dad came home because of this grand rule that he had, that only he could put discs into the systems. Only he could handle the jewel cases of these Sega CD games and Sony PlayStation games. Now you might be wondering to yourself, like, Tyler, this seems a bit extreme. You know, why was he like this? I mean, if these games were for you and not for him per se, why did he run such a tight ship when it came to how the games were taken care of and handled? Well, I think this honestly goes way back before I was even born to my dad's upbringing. I've mentioned before on this channel that my dad was the son of a comic book artist. My grandfather, Mike Esposito, was an inker for Marvel. He was famous for the work that he did in the Silver Age of comics, drawing Spider-Man and Wonder Woman, amongst many other characters. And it was growing up in this ecosystem of collectible comic books that I think my dad learned to take care of the comics that he owned, but not just the comic books, anything he owned. My dad also collected reel-to-reel film prints that he would find on the black market in the movie collecting scene of New York City back in the 70s. Guys, you know, you couldn't commercially own movies back then before VHS and DVD. You had to know a guy who knew a guy who you'd go down a back alley and like buy a film print. Really, he was the original collector, my dad. And so growing up with video games and collecting them with Dad, it became very apparent early on to him that this was going to become a medium and a hobby that was going to take off, and that these video games were going to become valuable one day. Really, I mean, I think he knew the kind of money he was sinking into this stuff, and I think he understood and knew that, hey, this stuff, it's very collectible in nature. You have CD jewel cases that are easily breakable, and this is the sort of thing that collectors look for, stuff that's in mint condition, things that are not going to crack or break. I think he had such good awareness for what this hobby was going to become and how valuable this stuff was going to be. And so we took very good care of our video games. And if I didn't, Dad was going to let me know. I was going to hear about it.
Sega CD games, as well as 32X CDs and TurboGrafx games. This cabinet has Super NES in it, this cabinet has Genesis in it, and these rest of these machines are here. Portables, tons of game machines. The Jag, the Super NES, Sega.
It got a little bit more complicated as I got a little bit older into elementary school and I started gaining more friends, especially in the new neighborhood that we moved to. I had a friend named Albert that I met around this time, and we were really good friends. We were both new to the neighborhood. It was a new development. And so we were actually going to each other's homes, you know, back and forth every day, it seemed. It didn't take long for us to realize that we both loved video games and we both had Nintendo games.
And who's this?
Who's who? Oh, Albert.
It's your friend Albert? Did you ever lose a tooth, Albert?
4.
4 of them? Man! 4 teeth!
And I've lost 1.
At least you didn't lose your whole head. Albert,
Fixing this clock.
fixing the clock. Yep. It's a beautiful day in the hot neighborhood.
He fixed my car too. I have to find. What is this? Chrome down. I'm looking like he's barking.
Did you tell Albert about Ninja Turtles in Time?
Yeah. Oh. No, I got off.
It is so wild hearing my dad talk about Ninja Turtles in Time on the Super Nintendo. I guess we had just gotten that game around the time this video was recorded.
We got another 8-bit one to hear Albert playing.
I remember back in these days of visiting his house and him visiting my house and playing my games and me going to his house playing his games. One day he said to me, "Tyler, can I borrow a game?" He wanted to borrow one of my NES games. This was actually where I learned about my dad's rules, because really, I had never had a friend up until this point to ever challenge his rules.
Merry Christmas, Albert.
Yo, you ran over me.
And so we had this little transaction, Albert and I. I was going to borrow one of his NES games, and in return, he could borrow one of mine. Before he could borrow one of mine, I went ahead and borrowed his game. So I brought it home, and not long after I brought it home, I was playing it. And I'm playing this NES game that I borrowed from Albert. It was either Popeye on the NES, Donkey Kong, Athena, one of the NES games that Albert owned. And my dad comes in and he sees me playing this game that he didn't buy for me, that he knew I didn't own. And so he starts sort of interrogating me. And he's like, "Where'd you get this?" And I tell him, "Oh yeah, I'm borrowing this game from Albert." "Oh, okay." And so after a little bit of him watching me play the game and us having a cordial conversation, I just nonchalantly say to him, "Oh yeah, and by the way, Albert wants to borrow one of my games." That's where you could start cutting the air with a knife. The tension rose in the room. You could cut it with a knife. Dad immediately was caught off guard, and he was like, "What? No. You don't let anybody borrow your games. Nobody can borrow your games." No friend had ever asked to borrow any of my games at this point. And so I remember being a little flustered as a kid. "What do you mean Albert can't borrow it? I'm borrowing his game. Of course he can borrow one of mine. It's like a trade. We're trading." No. Your games are your games. None of your friends can borrow your games. And so this is where Dad introduced me to the unwritten law of the land. His rule of never letting anybody borrow my games. He said to me, "Tyler, look, I trust you with these games. I know that you're going to take good care of them because I taught you to take good care of your things. But I don't trust anybody else with this stuff. And this stuff is expensive. They could go home with your games and they could throw them around. They could drop them on the ground, especially in the case of disc-based games. They could crack the disc, break them. They're not going to take care of the games like I know you will." I was still pretty flustered. I remember thinking, but I want to do this. I want to have these transactions with friends, let them borrow my game and I could borrow their game. And it was fun. It was something that was going to be fun. But no, Dad was like, "You can't do it. They can come over anytime they want and play your games at your house. No problem. Open door policy. But when it comes to lending this expensive stuff to friends, that was a rule not to be broken." Thinking about my dad's upbringing, I really understand it a little bit more. I understand that, growing up in a household with parents that came out of the Great Depression, who they didn't have hardly anything when they were growing up. And so to own these games that were expensive, we're talking games that were $50, $60, $70 sometimes in the early to mid 90s. I think a lot of you might be thinking right now, "Man, I don't know, Tyler, you can try to justify it as much as possible, but your dad seemed a little crazy when it came to this whole thing with borrowing games and taking, extreme care of these games." Well, there was an incident that happened when I was 3 years old that really, I think, is the explanation as to why this was such a big deal to Dad. When I was 3 years old, I had some neighbor friends come over to my house and asked to borrow my action figure. It was a Egon Spengler action figure from the Real Ghostbusters cartoon show.
Hello, my name is Ghostbuster.
As a little kid, I said, "Okay, of course, you can borrow my Egon Spengler action figure." And these older kids, they were 9, 10 years old, took my Egon Spengler action figure, proceeded to go back to their house with it, and burn the action figure in their fireplace. They melted the top part of his head, his face was burned, and they came back to my house, rang the doorbell. I opened it and they handed it back to me. Here you go, Tyler. And then they ran off. I stood there as a 3-year-old, my eyes just welling up with tears. I started crying profusely. This is something I remember. It's not on video. I remember this like it was yesterday, though, because it was so traumatic. And it was this incident. I mean, my dad was furious at these kids for doing this to me. And I cried so much. I was so traumatized by this entire incident of burning my Egon Spengler action figure.
Look!
Who's that?
Non-burnt.
My dad made those kids apologize to me. We went back over to their house and he made them apologize for what they had done to me, what they had done to my action figure.
It's a non-burnt Egon.
Wow, let's see him. Hey, I've never seen you not burnt.
It was from that point forward that my dad no longer trusted any of my friends with any of my things, especially when it came to expensive video games. So Albert, if you're watching right now, man, I'm sorry. You never had a chance borrowing my video games. It just wasn't gonna happen, man. Even though it sounds like my dad was really strict and really hard on me when it came to letting friends borrow games, Dad was a very generous man. He was somebody who went out of his way to make sure that me especially, but also my friends, make sure that they were cared for. I specifically remember a time when Albert and I were with my dad at KB Toys. He was with us and we were doing some shopping. Albert didn't have enough money to buy Zen the Intergalactic Ninja on the NES, great obscure Konami game. He really wanted to get the game. It was there on the store shelf at KB and he came up a little short. Well, my dad was very generous and gave him the rest of the money that he needed. Something like, $10, something like that. And there were other times too where my dad would do that. He would go out of his way to be generous to my friends. And so I don't want you to leave this video thinking that my dad was stingy or selfish when it came to our possessions and the things that we owned. He just was raised to really make sure that the things that we owned were taken care of. For me as an adult, being a dad now too, I can't say that I have adopted the same way of thinking. I know for me as a dad, I want to let go a little bit and not hold on so tightly to those things. And I want Hallie, my daughter, I want her to grow up with a great sense of giving and letting other people not even just borrow our things, but even just have our things. There are a lot of people out there who are less fortunate, and it is good to give.
Thank you.
You're welcome.